So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Ackerman, Executive Director of Columbus Citizens Foundation, and talking about Italy and its rich cultural history is like my favorite thing in the world. So I'm not usually the person who speaks to you. We usually have lots of interesting guest speakers. But I gave a talk at the Italian Cultural Institute last year about the reach of Italy's cultural influence across the globe. And a lot of people saw that advertised and then asked me if I would do it here. So if you don't like it, it's their fault. And hopefully you will like it. But one of the things that is always intriguing about Italy is that a relatively small country geographically has had an enormous power over culture and art and architecture and even urban planning, actually for a solid 2,000 years if we look at it that way. So we're going to do a very quick tour of the world through the Italian lens, and almost every one of these slides could be a lecture unto itself. So we're really going to move very fast, and then I look forward to hearing any comments or questions you have later. So we're not actually going to talk about the Romans, although we could, but I wanted to just ground this in. If you take a look at how broad the reach of the Roman Empire was, it's really quite extraordinary. And so it disappeared. But that map really shows that the Roman Empire extended all the way from Britain to very far into what we could consider the Middle East today. And they had quite deep penetration in a lot of these places. So, of course, we can go and visit Roman ruins in all of these places today, but that's really not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what happened after the Romans. I think it got turned off accidentally.
Can you click once on the presentation? Just once. Okay, now do.
Okay, so in the Middle Ages, believe it or not, Rome was a destination. And so while a lot of people today walk the Camino de Santiago in Spain, really Italy was a destination. So there were numerous official pilgrimage routes. This is one of them that led from France to Rome. And it's the beginning of a culture of tourism. Even though they're religious pilgrims, there became official places to stop along the way, churches you were meant to visit along the route. And of course, this was an economic engine. So people loved to see the pilgrims come. And in Rome, this became a big business as well. And businesses began to accrete even in 800, 900, 1000, 1100. And then Boniface VIII, who was the Pope credited with creating the modern Jubilee year, 2025 is a Jubilee year, he didn't do it for purely religious reasons. He wrote extensively that he had noted for years how many people came on these pilgrimages to Rome and how many people came specifically to St. Peter's. Which is obviously a different St. Peter's than we visit today, but nonetheless, he realized that there was powerful ways to grow the coffers of the church if you incentivized people to come in specific ways. So in 1300, he launches the official first Jubilee year in the modern era. And then, again, these Jubilee years have a lot of meanings. They were meant initially to be every 100 years, then they realized 50 years would be better, then they thought, oh, 25 would be even better. And then they had occasionally special Jubilee years. And 1487 was a special Jubilee year, and the medal on the left is Innocent VIII, and he's the person credited with launching the Inquisition, so Innocent maybe not so much. But that medal is in the Crest collection at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I worked for the Crest Foundation for 25 years, so I never miss an opportunity to point out the very special collections we have in the United States, thanks to people like Samuel Crest, who collected extensively and then made their collections public. And then on the right, it's a very interesting image. It's one of a series of 20 lunettes at a convent in Germany. But Jubilee years became so important that they began to be recorded. And so this church, convent, created a whole cycle after the 1487 Jubilee year. And that 1487 Jubilee year was created specifically to fight against the Ottoman Empire. There was a fear that Christianity was losing its hold on Europe. And so that Jubilee year specifically was meant to remind people of the importance of Christianity. And this cycle was for a group of nuns who couldn't travel to Rome for a variety of reasons, but they had their Jubilee experience by creating this series of murals and lunettes. And what's interesting about them is they depict pilgrims going to the 7 basilicas in Rome. And then in 1500, what happens? Map making becomes a very serious enterprise. And Germany takes the lead, and they're very, very beautiful, detailed maps. And not surprisingly, Rome becomes the focus of a lot of these map makings because people want to go there. Religious pilgrims, people who have reasons to want to do business with the Papal States. And so these very detailed maps of Rome begin to appear. This one is said to be the view from the Janiculum Hill. And so this, if anybody's ever been to the American Academy in Rome, that would be that vantage point looking down on the city. And then what really intrigued me, as I had reasons to learn more and more about the history of Italy and its internationalism, is that already in the 1600s, Italian Jesuit priests are all over Asia. So you can find in the 17th century Italian Jesuit priests in India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. So this was a very concerted effort to spread Christianity in Asia, but also many of these Jesuit priests managed to find their ways very significantly into the courts in Asia. And so there's sort of 3 waves of Japan having an embassy in Rome. So the first one is a very early attempt, and it's actually by a member of the royal family in Japan who converts to Christianity and wants to connect Japan more forcefully to Europe. So they have a very sort of short-lived, not quite embassy, but sort of embassy. Then the second wave of Japan in Rome is quite interesting because that never becomes an official embassy, but it's a delegation. And they spend time in Spain, in France, in other parts of Europe, and then they spend a very significant amount of time in Rome. And they want to kind of broker arrangements with the Papal States, mostly on a commercial basis. And so they also are thinking about already, there's sort of the New World enterprises as well, and Asia wants to participate in those enterprises. And then finally, in the 19th century, they opened the first official embassy in Rome. And it's Japan's first embassy in Europe, in Rome, to be the embassy to the Vatican. But nonetheless, it's a watershed moment of Asia really solidifying its relationships with Rome. And then this is something that I had the great privilege to be very involved with when I was at World Monuments Fund, which this is an area of the Forbidden City called the Qianlong Garden. And the Qianlong Emperor was the longest serving emperor in Chinese history. And he did something no emperor had ever done. He retired. And he took this quadrant of the Forbidden City and made it his private retreat. And he was a very erudite person. He was also the absolute most wealthy person in the 18th century. And so at the same time he's retiring and building his retreat area, the American Revolution is happening, Europe is redesigning its map substantially, but China is having a moment of quite substantial peace and prosperity. And so he was very interested in poetry and the arts. He was also interested in the larger world. So he, for instance, imports plate glass from France into China and creates a throne from plate glass. And he does a number of interesting things. And there are 3 Italian Jesuit priests who befriend him and become part of the court. And one of them is Giuseppe Castiglione, who is also a painter, and he becomes extremely close to the emperor. And so as the emperor is designing these various pavilions within the Chunlong Garden, Castiglione and his two brethren get very involved in the decorative campaign. So the only examples of non-Chinese art in the Forbidden City, today known as the Palace Museum, are the works done by these three Jesuit priests. And so here's an example. This is this is called Zhangquanzai. It's the studio of exhaustion from diligent service. And so when I was at World Monuments Fund, one of our great projects was restoring this. And we had a Chinese team and an American team that worked together. Other of my colleagues oversaw the actual work. But it's an extraordinary thing because inside this pavilion in particular is all the decorative campaign of the Italian Jesuit priests. So it's this very interesting combination of Chinese materials, Chinese traditional painting techniques, but then a Western sensibility. And then on the far left is one of the official portraits of the Chunlong Emperor done by Castiglione, and it's still in the Palace Museum collection, and it's considered one of the official portraits of the emperor, which is quite unusual. And then, because, as we know in the Western world, there's a tradition of equestrian paintings of monarchs, Castiglione did a series of equestrian paintings of the Chunlong Emperor, showing him when he was a young man, as well as an elder statesman. And so this is one of the examples of the Castiglione equestrian paintings. And so then, in the exact same time period, if you look at these iconic images of Russian architecture, it's quite fascinating because we see this and we immediately know we're in St. Petersburg, but it was all created by a group of Italian architects. So the two main ones are Rinaldi and Rastrelli. Rinaldi worked almost exclusively for Catherine the Great, and Rastrelli worked for the next generation, specifically Anne and Elizabeth. But what's really extraordinary about them is that they were specifically brought by the Russian court. So if you were, part of the Russian Empire, you could have had anybody come and do this. But they specifically were looking for Italian artisans, because this was considered really the height of, the standards for art and architecture of the day. So this particular building that I'm showing you is called the Chinese Palace at Oranienbaum, and it was built as Catherine's private retreat. And as it happened in her lifetime, she was really only there about 100 days across her lifetime. It's in actually a part of Russia on the Gulf of Finland where it's almost inaccessible most of the year. The weather is brutal, and so there's really only about literally 3 or 4 weeks out of the entire year when you could actually comfortably go to this part of Russia. Otherwise, it is covered under feet and feet and feet of snow. But the Chinese Palace at Oranienbaum is quite interesting because there was a wave that went all the way from England to St. Petersburg of an obsession with the Orient in this era. So that's, you'll find that lots of these manor houses and palaces of the day had either a Chinese room or a Japanese room or a Turkish room. And they share one thing in common with this, which is the architect had never been to Asia. So it was completely a fantasy of what they thought Asia was all about. And so the Chinese Palace at Oranienbaum is this very, beautiful estate. And the interiors were also done by Rinaldi. And they're quite fantastic because again, the wood floor that I'm showing you in that one room is all exotic Russian woods that were known at the time and really something only the aristocracy could afford. But the pattern is exactly what you'll find, in Western European palaces. So again, taking these Western sensibilities and applying them to another culture. The room underneath it, which maybe you can't see so well, but that all looks like wallpaper. It is not. It is actually glass beads that have all been sewn together in an extraordinary pattern. And so really, these were the height of fashion and taste and materials that money could buy at the time. And they're really extraordinary places. Uh-oh, why did it do that? Let's go back. And one of the other interesting things here is, even though we're not going to talk about the Romans, when I visited there at this point, probably close to 20 years ago, they were doing very extensive renovations of the exterior. And one of the things that they discovered was that there was a passive heating system that went around the edges of the building. And it's really drawn from ancient Roman bath technology. And so somebody like Rinaldi would have known about that. And so even in the summer, you needed to heat these buildings. But even the emperor didn't want to spend a lot of money unnecessarily. So this passive heating system was really quite a remarkable discovery as they were doing the renovation. So these buildings have lots of secrets still to reveal. And sometimes it's in that renovation process that you get to learn about these extraordinary techniques. So now we're moving over to Rastrelli, who himself is an interesting figure. So he comes to Russia when he's only about 20 years old. His father was a very well-known Florentine sculptor who went to work for the court in France. So Rastrelli was actually born in Paris. Then he comes to Russia with his father, and his father is quickly out of the story. They're interested in him, and he becomes this incredible court architect. And so this is Peterhof Palace, about an hour outside of St. Petersburg. And he is commissioned specifically to create a palace that rivals Versailles. And so you can see that the palace part is actually really kind of only 2 rooms deep. It's almost like scenography, that it's, this facade practically, but it's quite large. It takes a long time to walk from one end to the other. But it's these gardens that are extraordinary. And so, here you've got this Italian architect who's working on these incredible buildings, but is also charged with making something so dramatic that it's going to rival what they know about Versailles. And so this is the Catherine Palace in an area called Tsarsky Selo, which means Tsar's Village. It's just outside of St. Petersburg. And it's another one of these places that could only be used a mere few weeks out of every year. And I can tell you that the very first time I went in the winter, and the snow was as tall as I am. So it's really quite dramatic. But the Catherine Palace is, one of the, must-see sites for people who go to St. Petersburg. And it's really an extraordinary place. And the exterior was Rastrelli, and the interiors were Rastrelli. And so I'm showing you 3 rooms here to show you the kind of variety that Rastrelli was capable of. So you've got the very, very grand salon in the upper right, which kind of rivals the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. In the lower right is one of the more private, intimate rooms. And that extraordinary heater you see in the corner is all ceramic and quite beautiful. And then on the left is the chapel that was in the palace. And so this is one of a complex of buildings out at Tsarsky Selo. And again, quite incredible the way Italians predominated in this era. And then his last great commission was Smolny Cathedral, which again, it's not one building, it's a complex of about a dozen buildings. And really, again, absolutely extraordinary, the level of detail. And really, you couldn't have anything more classic Russian Baroque architecture than this building. But again, all out of Rastrelli's head. And then we're gonna move, I'm gonna just see if I can grab this. Move it over. Really what's quite incredible here is we're moving now to the Grand Tour, where really Italy takes absolute center stage. And I resisted the temptation to show you lots of maps of the Grand Tour, but you'll see that they start in England, end in Jerusalem, and they bypass France completely. So even though there might have been a time when we all would have thought France was the epicenter of culture, that was not true in the Grand Tour. And so you spend a lot of time in Italy in the Grand Tour. And one of the interesting things about the Grand Tour and its legacy is many of the paintings we know today that we love about iconic sites in Rome come out of this era. So this is a Panini painting that's also in the National Gallery in Washington. And it's really one of these iconic images of grand tourists. And so they're in the Pantheon, obviously. But it's really an incredible series of paintings that he did that became, the most famous images of the Grand Tour. So one of the other legacies coming out of the Grand Tour was that countries began to set up academies in Rome. So on the upper right is the American Academy in Rome, commissioned by J.P. Morgan, built by McKim, Mead & White. It's the only McKim, Mead & White building not in North America. And it's an extraordinary place. We could have a whole lecture about it. And then below it is the British Academy. And what's interesting about the British School in Rome, that was built as a temporary building for the 1901 Exposition in Rome. And here it is still today being used. And also one little tidbit about the British School at Rome, the largest single collection of guidebooks to Rome ever that go all the way back to the 17th century are in their library. So really an incredible focal point for understanding the history of Rome. The Grand Tour was meant to be kind of your finishing education if you were a British nobleman. And it took 2 to 3 years most of the time. And there was an itinerary that you were meant to follow. So you went to Venice, you went to Florence, you spent significant time in Rome, you went on to Pompeii, you went south, and then you went on eastward, and then came back. But Italy really became kind of the vision of the Grand Tour. And so it also engendered a whole set of artistic cultures. So you have a drawing on the left that's a depiction of grand tourists arriving in the Piazza di Spagna in Rome. And then a lot of people had these iconic portraits done that they took back home with them for their country manners, showing that they were on the Grand Tour and experiencing culture. One of my absolute favorite parts of the Grand Tour, though, is the way Vesuvius factors into it. So we all know that in 79 AD, Vesuvius erupted, Pompeii and Herculaneum, and all of the Vesuvian towns were buried. And then in the 18th century, Vesuvius erupts again. And so as people are going on the Grand Tour, there becomes this absolute fascination with the idea of going to Vesuvius. So they're interested in Pompeii, but it's Vesuvius. And so there's actually a whole cult that develops about what you should wear, what you should eat on your picnic on the slopes of Vesuvius. So there's a whole body of literature about not just the Grand Tour, but the experience of Vesuvius. And obviously it looms large even when you're in Naples, you can see it. And then it becomes a real spectacle. And so a very enterprising British person creates an incredible pyrotechnic show at the end of the 19th century called Last Days of Pompeii, and it tours all over the place. And it becomes this, incredible thing that even if you can't go on the Grand Tour, you can experience the Last Days of Pompeii. And it became so wildly popular that in the lower right, that is a performance of the Last Days of Pompeii on Coney Island. So it made its way here. And as we all know, Coney Island was a very big deal when it opened. It was an opportunity for the working class to have a recreation destination. And so the last days of Pompeii was wildly popular at Coney Island. And then you can't really talk about the spread of Italian culture and its influence across the globe without talking about Andrea Palladio, who was, arguably one of the most prolific and important architects of that era. But his work has really been copied right up to the present day. We've never lost our interest in the principles that he had. And he revives Vitruvius. Interestingly enough, he wrote what's considered to be the first architectural guide to Rome. And so he wasn't just an architect, but he really thought about what he was doing with his architecture. So I could show you endless examples of Palladio, but I showed you the Villa La Rotonda in Vicenza, which is probably the most iconic of his, and then the Church of the Redentore in Venice, which is on the Giudecca Canal. And again, he was all about symmetry and using the ancient forms. So he uses the pediment always as this kind of portico entry to his buildings. So a very iconic series of motifs are associated with Palladio. And then Palladio pops up in all kinds of places. So on the left is Castletown Castle in Ireland, in County Kildare. It's considered the first example of Palladio abroad. But most importantly, if you're Irish, this building is very, very important because it was not an Anglo-Irishman, it was an Irish-Irishman who built this. So, for people who care about British culture, that was a very, very important distinction, that an Irishman became wealthy enough, to afford to have a building like this built. And it's always been considered a Palladian building. And then on the right is something called Villa Palladio in Jaipur, India. And it goes back about 100 years at this point. And it's marketed as being inspired by Palladio and built on Palladian principles. And Jaipur, for those people who've been to India is the pink city, so that's why it's got this, pink hue. But it is very much considered to be a Palladian building. And then if we come to the United States, Palladio figures very, very importantly. Jefferson himself wrote extensively about his inspiration from Palladio and why it mattered to him. But Jefferson was not the first person to bring Palladio to the United States. So in the upper left, that is actually a manor house in Charleston, South Carolina. That was the very first Palladian building built here. And for some reason at this moment, I am blanking on the name of that house, but it'll come to me. And then the next Palladian building to be built, so that's about 1730, that building. Underneath it is the library in Newport, 1740, also considered to be one of the early Palladian examples in the United States. Then, of course, you have in 1780, Monticello on the upper right, Jefferson's home, which is, without question, built entirely on Palladian principles and meant to evoke some of his grand estates in Italy. Then underneath it, that's the Rotunda at the University of Virginia, the library. It's about 1820, 1822. So these four examples are amongst the earliest of Palladian architecture in the United States. And there's no doubt that that is absolutely true when you look at them. But it was an important statement for somebody like Jefferson about connecting the birth of the United States and the iconography we were going to use to somebody like Palladio. And then, Palladio wasn't the only inspiration. So the building on the upper left, that is the interior of the entry hall in San Francisco City Hall, built about the turn of the century. And very, very grand, and very much evokes these Italian Renaissance and Baroque interiors. And then underneath it, you see the exterior of the San Francisco City Hall compared to St. Peter's in Rome. Not an exact copy by any means, but very much built with that inspiration. And then that grand staircase in the San Francisco City Hall against Michelangelo's Laurentian Library in Florence. And these kind of stairs that sort of ooze out, that is not an accidental reference. I mean, they absolutely knew that they were tying it to this great Renaissance staircase. Then I'm going to go back in time a little tiny bit, because as the United States was being built, particularly the East Coast, you have to remember what our circumstances were. So just to give you a sense of scale, in 1800, the population in Brooklyn was 1800, the population of Brooklyn was 10,000 people. In 1900, the population of Brooklyn was 1 million. So you just have to imagine the scale on which things were being built. And I use Brooklyn as an example because that was the industrial hub. Manhattan was still a little bit of a backwater. But there was everything going on in Brooklyn. Manufacturing, shipping, the Gowanus Canal, even though it's only 2 miles long, most profitable canal ever in the United States. So that was an incredible hub. So they're building things like mad. And again, they're thinking about, what you're going to telegraph to the world about who you are. So I've pulled out these 2 examples of kind of classic domestic Renaissance architecture. So in the upper left, that's the Palazzo Medici Riccardi in Florence, and then the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. So these become kind of the standard for Italianate domestic architecture here. And I didn't put in a slide of Zamość in Poland, because that could have led us down a whole path about the influence of Italy on urban design. So that'll have to be a future lecture. But this whole idea of humanism and building at a human scale and connecting us to our environment was not just architectural. I mean, they were pulling on the principles, because you could argue that Florence was the beginning of urban planning as we know it. They were extensive writings in that period about how the city should feel, how you should move through the city. So as we're building our nation, all of these things are trickling back to us. And the City Beautiful movement, which starts here, more or less kind of 1900, they're drawing on all these principles. So as we walk around this city and see an incredible amount of Italianate architecture, that was not accidental at all. And so one of my favorite examples here in New York City is Rosario Candela was a Sicilian immigrant who came to go to architecture school at Columbia, and he became arguably the most prized domestic architect here. So there are about 75 of his buildings still existing in New York City. And at least when a lot of my friends were starting to buy apartments in the 1990s, people killed themselves to get into a Rosario Candela building. They're mostly on the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side. And he was really a glorious architect who kind of understood what people wanted. And there was even about 10 years ago an exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York called Elegance in the Sky, and it was all devoted to his architecture. And so he was such a prized architect that when developers worked with him, they would create these incredible brochures to market the interiors, the exteriors. Sometimes there were very beautiful courtyards in these buildings that were private, intimate spaces for the people who lived there. Oops. So these were very, very, important buildings in the day and remain so today. And then it wasn't limited to just architecture on the Upper East Side. So on the left is a building that today is called the Fifth Avenue Hotel. It's a McKim-Mead and White building. And if you go back to when it was built and it was reviewed in the paper, they make the references to the Palazzo Medici Riccardi with the idea that there's a kind of rusticated lower level. It gets more refined as you go up. And that was a very common Florentine Renaissance device. And it gets repeated here in the United States quite a bit. The building on the far right is an apartment building around 95th Street and Park Avenue. It's by Carpenter, who is a contemporary of Candela's, and Carpenter buildings are all along Fifth Avenue. So another prolific architect who used the same device of kind of the rusticated, rougher hewn lower levels, got more refined as you got up, and then when you got to the very top floor, an absolute elegant palace in the sky. Anybody know what the one in the middle is?
Post office?
No. No. That's the Newark Public Library, 1901. So this was such a strong device that it gets used in public buildings quite a bit too. It wasn't just domestic architecture. And so Newark, was a very important city at the turn of the century, a manufacturing hub, an important, near a port, so very wealthy at the time, and they could afford to have this kind of architecture. And then we don't give up on Italy. We just sort of take a pause. So, after the kind of flurry of building that goes to about 1930, you don't kind of hear about Italian architecture that much here again. But in the 1960s, we go back to this incredible connection to Italy and its principles of architecture. So this is the Watergate building, a Watergate complex built in 1962-63, built by Moretti, who at the time was a very, very famous architect in Europe and responsible for a lot of important commissions. And this is a very important complex when it opens. Infamous later for other things, but that has nothing to do with its architecture. But again, the kind of very interesting principles that continue on. The idea that these created kind of communal spaces and almost like a sort of piazza within each element of the building. So again, drawing from these Renaissance principles about the environment in which we live. And then this is an aerial view at the time. The George Washington Bridge bus station opened in the early 1960s. What's really astonishing when you look at this historic photo is when you look across at the Palisades and there is nothing there. If we went there right now, there's a building in every piece of that view shed. So, a very unspoiled view of the Palisades across from New York City. But this amazing building that Nervi created for a bus station with this incredible, that is all concrete, by the way, even though it looks like wings and kind of light, it is all poured concrete. And bus stations, at least in New York City for most of us, are terrible places. But this was really a very dramatic building when it opened. And an important thing, and Nervi was very, very famous at this moment because he had been responsible for most of the buildings of the 1960 Olympics in Rome. So getting him here to do this kind of public commission was really, really something. And then for my class at Pratt, where I teach I teach about preservation and kind of the concepts of heritage, I always show this slide. So that's the Campidoglio in Rome, Michelangelo uniting this space that was an ancient Roman space with this very elaborate geometrical design on the area of the piazza, and then the three buildings. Which today, the two on the flanking sides are museums, and the one in the back is the mayor's complex in Rome. against Lincoln Center. And so, what is Lincoln Center? You go up a staircase like you do at the Campidoglio. There's a very elaborate geometric pattern on the ground, and you're uniting three disparate buildings into a whole and making it feel very much like you've arrived. And so again, a very large number of architects worked on Lincoln Center. And so it was no one person's concept, but definitely this is not an accidental juxtaposition. And then I'm going to end with this because I know people want to get up and stretch their legs. But, as we start to think about this, or maybe you'll never be as compulsive as I am and always looking at what's around you, but whether you are in South Carolina, New York City, Indiana, Las Vegas, New Mexico, Southern California, or Georgetown in Washington, D.C. Once you get this lodged in your head, you can't stop seeing Italian architecture wherever you go. And I'm going to leave you with that thought. Thank you so much. So you're not fleeing for the doors, so that's good.
You mentioned Palladio, right? So every time I go to supermarkets and so on, and I happen to get a nickel back, I get a nickel.
A nickel, you probably have one in your pocketbook. In the back of the nickel, there is a building. And that is a Palladio building. It's the house of Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
Because he loved Palladio, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely.
So every time I ask the student, the young people that are the cashier, I said, can you tell me what building this is? And they go, Lincoln Memorial. I said, look carefully. Look, it's written right there. It's Monticello, which means little town where Thomas Jefferson lived. And Thomas Jefferson loved Italians, and he was the only president who spoke 6 languages fluently.
I didn't know that.
Know which ones?
French,
French, yes.
English,
English. Italian, yes. Spanish.
do you speak Latin?
Latin, very good. So,
German.
No, so English, Latin, Italian, and Greek. Italian, French, and Spanish.
Oh, great, I didn't know that.
So I teach that to all the people that are just cashier. Every time they give me a nickel.
Bonifacio, we have a question. We have Bonifacio the ninth here.
That's true.
I'm just curious, at what point did the Italian presence be recognized in America for prominence in architecture?
Very early on. So in Jefferson's day, there's already an agreement that the principles of Roman architecture are what we want to adopt as the language of democracy. And there's extensive writings about it. And then because Jefferson was so knowledgeable about Palladio, he really adopted that as kind of what should be part of our master planning for buildings in Washington, D.C. So there's very early a recognition that they want to use Roman and Italian Renaissance architecture as the devices here to telegraph who we are as a people. And that's not speculation, it's really written extensively then. And then I think the only other thing I would say is we don't realize how close the ties between Italy and the United States were. Italy's unification happens after we're already an independent nation, but not so much later. So Italy's going through a lot of the same struggles, and Jefferson kind of recognized that. But interestingly enough, people who would have been British, but they were of Italian descent. So there are 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence who were of Italian descent. So there was already a tiny, but a Italian population here, separate from mass immigration, 1880 to 1930. And then there's a philosopher named Gaetano Filangieri who writes extensively about the lessons from humanism, the ideas of democracy, and he has extensive correspondence with Benjamin Franklin. And there were letters back and forth for years where they debate about these things. So there was an idea that, Italy, even though it didn't exist yet, but like the kind of principles coming out of the Renaissance were what we needed to follow. And so there was a very strong recognition early on.
And it was a good way to break from the British tradition.
Absolutely.
Of the Revolution, the idea that we didn't want to be seen as a British.
Absolutely. No, that's a very big part of it. So, so we break away. You don't want Britain to be your history either. So you have to start inventing your own narrative. And that's how Columbus factors into this. Columbus becomes an American symbol very early on because you need to seize on things that have nothing to do with Britain. And so they seize on this idea of, Columbus as the first immigrant to the United States. And so the first celebration of Columbus is called Discovery Day, and it's actually in 1792. So we're founded in 1776, and you need like a feel-good moment. So they seize on this idea of Columbus, and they call it Discovery Day, not Columbus Day. But Columbus becomes this theme, and it's also the same thing. He's an accidental Italian from the point of view of the narrative in those early years, but it's very much about what you just said. If you're a new country, you don't want to keep invoking the people you just got away from as your history. So, and that was very appealing too, because British architecture has some Palladianism in it, but British architecture looks quite different too. So that was also part of seizing on this kind of Roman and Renaissance tradition, that it has no connection to Britain. So there is, despite what happens to Italian immigrants a couple hundred years later, there is a kind of admiration for Renaissance and Roman culture right away.
Again, out of curiosity, how did a Sicilian immigrant, Rosario Candela, get to the position where he could design an apartment on Park Avenue?
He comes to the United States specifically to go to Columbia Architecture School, so he was not, he was not a poor immigrant to this country. He graduates from Columbia, and like lots of Columbia graduates before and after him, he's a good salesman. So he starts working right away, and he apprentices in the right architecture firm. They recognize his strengths, and then he goes out on his own. But yeah, no, it's an incredible story that he managed to become the architect of the day, right along Carpenter and others. But, you will still see in marketing materials from, real estate agencies, you will still see them market Candela buildings as an important thing. So, he's still very revered as an architect. Yeah, it's sort of the same thing. How did the first director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art end up being an Italian immigrant? He was knowledgeable, and he had a lot of chutzpah. And so, they became New Yorkers quickly and knew how to promote themselves, so. Yeah. Scott, I saw Scott have his hand up.
Even though Palladio was a Renaissance, I guess, era figure, I know that the founding fathers assiduously studied the Roman Republic.
They did.
And so I'm almost thinking that Palladio was, since he also touched back to Roman times, that was one way of them. It's not just pushing off from Britain, but it was also allying themselves with an earlier great republic, and Palladio was sort of maybe their avenue to get,
absolutely.
to by the look of it.
I absolutely, and I think the structure of the Senate that we have comes directly from Roman times. On that map, there were 3 different colors. There were the areas that were controlled by the empire, there were the areas that were controlled by the Senate, and then there were the areas that were sort of like commonwealths where you had a mercantile arrangement with those people. And so even that filtered into, you know, our concept of, you know, how we would control land, that there would be, you know, federally controlled land and state controlled land and private property, and, you know, and, you know, the arrangement we have with Puerto Rico goes right back to, you know, Roman times, this idea that you have a kind of, you know, commonwealth situation where there's some parts of it that connect federally and then the rest of it is locally administered. So no, they were drawing on, you know, the Roman governance example very strongly. So. Okay. I don't think there are any more questions, so we'll let everybody go out into the cold, cruel world. Thank you very much.